Inside the windowless cube, a beaten and broken species known as the Cortez sat. It was a single male, Commander Snutlick, formerly captain, who had been promoted thanks to his aggression against those in Sector 187. He sat there, unable to do anything except be inside his thoughts. Ever since he was captured, he had not eaten or drank anything in what he figures is at least one of his own days, and he was beginning to show signs of severe fatigue. He didn't have a chance to even get any provisions, any water, anything, as they threw him into this cell, just dropping him on the floor, not caring about his injuries. As he sat there, he looked down at his leg, didn't even have time for a splint, as it was barely held together by primitive bandages that his own medics were able to put on. He looked at his hand, still wrapped up as he was missing several digits, and he started to feel up in his face to see if any of the cuts had healed, and simply feeling dried and flesh blood on his semi-clawed hand. He wondered how it could come to this. How could the Cortez be defeated like this? How could it be possible? Within several hours of him being dropped into that cubed room, a video feed, three-dimensional feed, showed up on the opposite wall. The scene didn't change. It was apparently a live feed of his former ship, the Ornikuk, at least what was left of it. It seemed to be drifting through space, and every once in a while something would simply float out of one of the many sectors of the hull that had blown apart. Large sections of the engine compartment had been totally ripped to pieces by some sort of weapon. Something had torn it apart. He remembered thinking that this was impossible. How could something do this? In the background of the video feed, he could see that other ships of his race were there, most of them cut in half, torn asunder, or simply just scrap and slag as they floated through the emptiness vacuum of space. He still sat there and wondered how could his fleet be defeated. He thought back of sitting on the bridge of the Ornikuk as he looked across, getting his new position, his new status. His bridge crew did not refer to him as captain anymore, simply commander. And he stood tall and proud at this, even though, in truth, he knew he didn't quite deserve it. He had been raised as a hero for taking down a threatening species, and yet still remained as a captain of the ship. He believed it would be politically advantageous for him to remain a ship's captain, so he asked for his same billeting. This was probably the only reason he was still breathing. It was only a few of their solar rotations from the time they had taken down those pesky things they call humans, and he still looked at the whole ordeal with a sense of pride, believing he had been the one to save his own kind from some sort of invasive species that might have taken them over. Being as dangerous as they were, especially their electronic warfare, which was those machines they had, he knew that it was best that they were gone. It wasn't long before sensors began to go off throughout the entirety of the Cortez systems. They started to see multiple incoming vessels from all different directions. Originally, they thought this was some sort of glitch. Somebody was playing a game on them. Maybe someone had hacked into their system and was simply putting shadows out there. But no, many somethings were coming in at faster than light, and they would be there very, very soon. A lot of people thought this had to be a joke because nothing moves that fast. Several ships seemed to be skipping from one sector to the other within minutes of going from one sector. But the sensors were not lying. Eventually, they were able to get some sort of readout, some sort of visual on these ships, and they all looked similar and different at the same time. They looked close, and many of them had a similar boxy design, almost like flying bricks. Yet they couldn't figure out what it was, because some had a more narrow look to them, almost as though the shape of a spear or a blade. Others were very wide to the top and bottom. He couldn't figure out why it was this way. Some used fusion torches, other ones they couldn't see any type of vectoring, any type of engines. They assumed it was some sort of gravimetric or something along those lines. But each one of them was heading towards the Cortez systems as fast as they could move. At least that's what they could figure, because nothing moves that fast without a purpose. Immediately, the word went out to strengthen the defenses, as they had something heading their way. They believed whatever would jump in would simply jump in and face the Cortez weapon systems and fall to their glorious might, like all others have fallen before. Many of the Cortez used their own slaves, put them on ships, and told them to fight the enemy or be shot by the Cortez themselves. They would simply be cannon fodder, meat shields to the Cortez ships. Commander Snotlick was in the second line, as his ship was not truly a frontline combatant, but more of an exploration vessel. Though it did have some weapons on it, it wouldn't do very well in a large slug match in space. So he sat there and watched closely. He watched closely as one of these groups came in, jumped out of FTL, and before the Cortez ships could even target it, they began to fire. No words were given. Nothing. No warning. No hailing. No nothing at all. They just began to fire. At ranges they didn't even believe was possible. Energy weapons sprayed out from the front of these ships and began to cut through the Cortez fleets. The battle groups tried to fight as best they could. They set up all sorts of their version of chaff, decoys, or anything, but these new invaders were completely unfazed by this. They simply readjusted their weapons and continued to fire. Large turrets began to raise up out of the sides and began to fire, and they found out very quickly that these large cannons carried one hell of a large round. Their sensors would read 13 meters in diameter and another 35 meters in length, completely spherical down to a point. These spikes were launched at speeds didn't even think was possible to reach outside of using an FTL engine, and would simply pierce through a Cortez ship from stem to stern. But that wasn't enough. They would continually be hit, barraged by all sorts of weapon systems that were coming in, strange weapons that were firing in using some sort of propellant and thrust vectoring to make sure they struck their target. If they exploded close, the Cortez ships would be snapped in half by a single hit, and yet they would not stop. This new species was chewing through their ships like they weren't even there. With that, Commander Snotlick was told to take command of a group and told to charge through the enemy to try to slow them down so that the core worlds could prepare for this new enemy. But before he could do anything, another group came in from the flanks, and another and another. He began to get readouts of what was coming in, but all these different groups were slightly different. But they all were the same. Similar weapon systems, but the design, the exterior design of the ship was almost never the same. Some of them seem almost as though they were frigates or destroyers. Others looked like actual dreadnoughts. Some looked like simple cargo vessels from the way they were designed. But each one, as soon as they got within range, began firing with hellish abandonment. The commander ordered all of his into a formation that put his ship towards the rear. He knew that his ship could not handle a direct hit. In fact, none of them could. He watched as an entire battle group was cut to ribbons in less than 3.5 minutes. They feared this. What was going on? Who were they? What did they want? He simply set out a hailing, trying desperately to try and get them to talk. He explained who he was. He shown a video of himself and sent it to the enemy that was attacking him, but nothing came back. He saw his front lines start getting torn asunder as they were barely able to get their weapons within range. Any sort of effective range was barely able to scratch the paint of these new ships. Many of them started to expand the front. He started to worry this was a new type of weapon system, but no, it was a simple shield. They found out very, very quickly that they had faced an enemy that was ready for them. Definitely ready for them. The shield was so dense, several dozen meters of hardened material dressed in layers in between, woven with all sorts of different absorbent materials. It was insane and impossible to punch through. Even though it was targeted by the heaviest weapons they had, it did not punch through that ship. Not only that, but that ship was joined by others that seemed to form a wall, a huge circular wall. And as they began to maneuver, it was easy to see that they would move off to the side, allow their own ships to fire right past them, and then move back in a way so that their larger ships would not take a strike. This was insane. Who the hell uses physical barriers like this? Well, then again, we use meat shields, he thought. Why not? With this, the commander called desperately for more reinforcements, and they showed up very quickly. But they were very soon dispatched, being torn asunder. And as he tried desperately to get his ship to move, the Ornacook just stood there. He didn't understand what was going on, but then realized that something was just off. His helmsman was screaming that he didn't have control of the ship. They'd been struck by something. Something had fried their engines. It wasn't nothing he could do. Sir, it's frozen. Everything's frozen. Nothing's responding, sir. With that, Commander Snotlick began to pray to the Almighty for his own salvation. He didn't care about the crew. He didn't care about those he had sent to be his shield. He only cared about his own well-being, and he simply prayed up. To his surprise, within a few minutes, the engines spun back up, and he ordered for his ship to run as fast as possible. They needed to get back, he said. We need to get back and tell everybody what's happening, what's coming for them. And with that, the Ornacook spun around as fast as possible, killing several people inside from not warning them of the sudden vectoring, and then launched in FTL speed out, leaving the rest of his people to be slaughtered. When he got back, he saw that his fleet had been assembled and was continuing to do so and reinforce itself, but they had no idea what was coming. Commander Snotlick tried desperately to send a message to tell them what was going on. They had to get close. They had to get as close as possible. But of course the leaders, being as arrogant as they were, said, "No one could possibly beat us. There's no way that anyone could do what you're saying. Your sensors must be wrong." Snotlick sent the video of what had happened, and they still didn't believe it. Not until more of the enemy ships had jumped in. More of them than before. There was even more. How was there even more? Didn't they shoot a few of them? Didn't they get a few of them? How was there any more? Snotlick immediately ordered his ship towards the rear formation so that he could just observe. He knew his ship couldn't handle too much, but before he got to the back, a round of something had taken the back of the engines off, and the engines were gone. Not that he couldn't turn them on, they were just not there anymore, and the ship drifted. The vectoring thrusters were able to keep them from spinning so fast it turned everybody into jelly, but he had to sit there and watch as the front lines began to fire desperately at this new enemy. The new enemy firing back as fast as they could. Even smaller, faster ships began to vector their way around, moving around the formations, trying to flank around to make sure they could get a good shot. Most of the Cortez fleet paid them no mind. They believed these were simple fighters, but these simple fighters packed a weapon directly into their keel. As they lined up, they began to fire these weapons, and it turned out to be simply a smaller version of that giant rod they were firing. They didn't understand. Who in the hell uses kinetics? Energy weapons don't run out of ammo, but what the... And as he thought that, he watched as the battleship that had followed him through with the expansion fleet, the Sundrake, was torn to pieces by dozens of hits. He watched and realized that the enemy fleet that had come in was systematically targeting each and every one of the vessels, targeting the largest vessels first. And he watched as the front of the Sundrake was ripped to pieces. The only thing left was the engine compartment along with some of the crew compartment. But they weren't done. The enemy continued to fire on it until the entire ship ripped itself into tiny, tiny pieces of slag. Snotlick couldn't believe what he had just saw. One of the mightiest dreadnoughts they had reduced to nothing in minutes. Within moments of it being hit, It had turned into a completely useless hulk, as most of the weapon systems had been completely destroyed. With that, a few of the Cortez ships realized the danger and immediately charged towards the enemy ships, trying to move left, right, up, down, center, and all other directions, trying desperately not to get hit. Eventually, they would get close, that the weapons became somewhat effective, and they began to take some of the approaching ships down, not taking them out, but simply setting them adrift, as they were not able to punch through the hulls enough to cause catastrophic damage. But as they took one down, it seemed two would take their place. More and more across all sectors was coming in, and they could not understand why they were being crushed so much. Who were they? It's not like sent another message out, begging the attackers to stop. We have done nothing to you. We are innocent. With that, it was amazing to see all the weapon systems from the enemy fleet suddenly stop. And then a message came through. They saw a video. It was a grizzled old man who had a look of no fucks given, but he seemed to want to tell them something. Innocent. Innocent! You are the ones who slaughtered the innocent, you son of a bitch. You killed our people. With reckless abandonment, you slaughtered every single one of them. And we will not let that stand. Now, face karma, bitch. With that, the video feed cut off, and instantly all the weapons began to fire again, but this time, the fleet that was attacking charged in with all their might. They brought themselves down to bear on the first planet that was being held by the Cortez. And without even a single moment's hesitation, once in weapons range, they began to fire down on the planet, reducing it to molten slag in less than an hour. The Onakuk was already on its way to the other side of the planet when this started, but it only could sit there and watch as the planet itself was completely decimated in barely a fraction of the time it took for an entire fleet of his own ships to do the same. And that is the moment he realized they were really and truly fucked. With that, he called out again with a sort of desperation, begging for all sorts of mercies. But he did not get a response, and before he knew it, he saw that several other ships had been completely ripped apart, and soon his own ship went adrift as the emergency power began to run out. Without engines, they had no way of spinning it back up. He was pretty much screwed. With that, he waited for his time. He was already hurt, as he had broke his leg when he had fallen over once the ship was hit. Losing the engines was one thing, losing crew was another. But he looked down, and not only did he realize he was bleeding down his face, but the compound fracture in his leg was extremely painful. He just sat there and waited in the dark with the rest of them for judgment to come. Judgment came as he heard the doors being cut open, and horrible sounds of stomping metal on metal came down the hallways. With no power, there was no gravity, so they simply sat there and floated. Every once in a while, blood from one of his own crewmates, or his own, he couldn't tell, had been splatting on the walls, but it was also bouncing around in simple balls through the air. He looked around and ordered his crew to get ready to defend themselves. They grabbed what weapons they could, and before they realized anything, the door itself began to be cut open. They saw something create sparks around the side. It started from one side and simply burned within seconds all the way up the side, across the top, and down the other side. And eventually, what the hell was going on? And the door was flown from its own moorings, and it smashed into Snotlight with such force that it ripped several of his fingers off and broke his arm. He floated off to the side, and he saw with horror huge metal bipeds walk through with weapons big enough that they would take out his entire leg off his body with one single shot. In fact, he probably wouldn't even survive being hit across the head with the barrel of them. They came in, and anyone who fired at them was immediately taken down. Large holes were put in the hull as they shot right through. It seemed as though these were pressurized suits, as they didn't have a problem with the fact that most of the air was already starting to escape. Snotlick desperately tried to get away from the hulls and hide himself underneath one of the consoles. And as he looked up, holding his busted up hand underneath his armpit, he looked up at one of them, and it was looking down at him. He couldn't see the face through whatever the hell type of visor this was, but he realized that his time had come. He tried to make peace, but before he could do that, he began to beg for mercy. Beg and cry and plead. He didn't even care that some of his crew could see him. He offered up the lives of his crew, and that's when they realized that their commander was a douchebag, and a coward to boot. With that, one of them looked at the crew members and said, "Where is this Snotlick guy?" The crew member pointed over towards the commander, as the commander was pleading and saying, "You can take them all, you can take them all. Just leave me be, please. Let me live. You can kill them all, just let me live." The crew member pointed and definitely had a set of malice in his eyes. With that, whatever the biped was realized what was going on, walked over, looked down at Snotlick, who was being held at weapons point by another metal biped. And all he heard was, "So this is him? What a fucking pussy." With that, the weapon was put to the side, and a huge metal hand reached down, grabbed Snotlick by the throat, and started to drag him out. He thought for sure he would have been shot, but now he didn't know what was going to happen to him. As he was being dragged down the hall, his wounds became more and more and more apparent. The compound fracture in his leg screamed every time it scraped against the ground, and he squealed into the air himself, not realizing that he was making even more of a spectacle of himself to what was left of the bridge crew. They all looked with complete disappointment at their so-called hero, whining like a baby as he was being dragged down the hallway, leaving odd, floating trails of blood as they went. With that, he realized he was pretty much done. Being thrown inside one of the shuttle immediately started to unlatch itself from the Onakuk. He could barely see through the little bit porthole that the Ornacook had been torn apart, but it was still in one piece, unlike most of the ships that were out there. But as soon as the umbilical broke free, the last of the seals went. Those that were inside would suffocate very, very quickly, as all the atmosphere was now sucked out, not only the holes left by their own weapon systems, but now the gigantic hole from the boarding craft. Snotlick could only look, and he started begging for his life again as he sat in the corner. He could feel the entire ship thrust vectoring left and right so it could get back, and eventually he could feel it landing. With that, the same one that had grabbed him before once again grabbed him by the throat and dragged him down the hallway. He felt there was the artificial gravity, and he looked around amazed at what was going on. This ship, it was fresh, it was clean, it was so advanced looking, it was amazing. It made his look like some sort of tugboat. What the hell was going on? But he didn't have time, as his body was simply thrown into the room he found himself, and the door slammed shut. He kept thinking about this every time he looked up and saw what was left of the Ornacook. His precious ship, the only thing that truly ever mattered to him, aside from himself, was just a hulk. He watched as one of the bridge crew's bodies slowly floated out the hallway and out into space. He didn't care much about what he saw. He just realized that everyone he knew was dead now. That started to hurt him, just a little. For several more hours he stayed there watching it happen, and eventually the door slid open, slammed. Inside walked the grizzled old man. He walked over as one of those mechanical beasts, bipeds, was right behind him. So this is him? Yes, sir. Doesn't look like much, does he? No, sir. You can leave now. Yes, sir. And immediately, the one in the metal suit pulled up his visor just to get an honest-to-God look at Snotlick as he was down in the corner, simply looking pathetic with his torn uniform and all his injuries. And then simply turned and walked away, giving a strange motion with his hand as he did, as he raised his hand up as his fist and then raised his middle digit, and then simply left, making sure the door shut behind him. The grizzled old man stood in front of Snotlick. You don't know who I am, but that doesn't matter much now. Snotlick tried to say something, but he seriously couldn't, with all the damage that had done to his face after being grabbed and basically choked on the way here and slammed into the wall. Even though he had time to heal about a day or so, what he imagines, even though the light itself never stopped, it did flicker a lot. He tried to figure out how long he'd been there, but it didn't matter anymore. All he could get out of his mouth was, Why? Why? Why, you ask? Well, let me tell you what you stepped in. And I don't just mean a pile of shit. You stepped into a bear trap wrapped in razor wire that was attached to a landmine that had a nuke. That colony that you decided to find and land on. Well, who do you think the first folks you met was? Humans. No, they weren't humans. That was artificial intelligence. Those were robots, androids. They're in common use by humans. And I don't mean use as in they're our slaves. I mean use as in we work with them. They wouldn't have any way of advancing themselves without human ingenuity and invention. And, in retrospect, that really helps them out. Which is why, whenever we have to go into stasis because we're too busy killing each other, then they kind of help us out by watching over. Stasis pods. Snotlick suddenly realized why the humans were in pods, but it still didn't make sense. Why stasis? Well, quite simply, you horny little asshole, referring to the horns on Snotlick's head. You see, we humans are, shall we say, dangerous. And we're mostly dangerous to each other. So it's pretty common for some asshole to think, well, I'm just going to kill everybody else and become ruler of all humanity by starting some sort of war or some sort of biological plague or whatever it might be. In those cases, many times, to make sure that the plague burns itself out, or nanomachines, or whatever it might be, we have to put ourselves en masse in stasis. That colony that you decided to attack had barely been set up for about 3 years, our years, which, according to what I see here, as you looked on a small device, is about 5.5 in your terms. We barely had anything set up. We were lucky to get what we had there. Most everything you saw was prefabricated and then simply installed. Very little was actually built. You landed the ship? Snotlick was still trying to wrap his brain around this. Yeah, mostly was a ship, which was mostly buried underground, which is where most everybody was. Now, I want you to understand something, you piece of garbage. When you decided that you were going to cause all sorts of trouble, did you think maybe, just maybe, There might be someone out there amongst the stars, bigger, faster, stronger, and meaner than you. No. Cortez. Unbeatable. Undenied. Shut the hell up. Alright, I'm going to just let you in on a little secret here. We humans really, really care about certain things. And in particular, one of those is family. Family? Yes. My family was in Sector 187. My entire family was in Sector 187. I expected that they would eventually move to Sector 212, which is a garden planet. It's beautiful there, which is where I wanted to retire after my 150 years was up. But no, of course not. We have to deal with people like you. I don't... 212? It was at that point Snotlick started to put things together. The sector numbers were actually galaxies, similar to Sol Sector, anything from the Sun all the way out to Pluto. That was one sector. And now he realized that humanity had colonized over 200 separate sectors, which dwarfed even the Cortez species, who had only been able to colonize a few dozen. They suddenly realized that they had actually awoken a sleeping dragon, quite literally. Oh, we didn't realize. I didn't mean to, didn't order the... It doesn't matter, you piece of shit. I'm keeping you alive for one reason, so you can see what your species, your people, your arrogant ass had actually brought. With that, he turned and, using his electronic device, flipped the view on the screen. It was no longer a picture of the Ornacook floating through space, no. It was a visual of their home planet. The Cortez home planet had been reduced to cinders. Do you know what this is? No, wait, no, you didn't. Yes, we did. You recognize it because we left your moons intact. No, how dare you? Snotlick tried to actually lash out, but the old man simply raised his foot and slammed it down onto the broken leg. As Snotlick squealed in pain, the old man said, "Alright, listen up, you asshole. The only reason we left you alive in the first place is very simple. We wanted to see the measure of those who decided to slaughter civilians through orbital bombardment. That planet had no orbital defenses. That planet had no aerial defenses. It only had personnel, and those personnel weren't even persons. But you destroyed them all. You killed them all. The men, the robots, the women, the children, all of them. Snotlick tried desperately to put words together, trying in any way, shape, or form to start to put any sort of defense. But before he could say anything, the old man chimed in. And we wanted to see how good you were, how good soldiers you were, so when we found out that was you, the one who had ordered this assault, the one who had gone down to the planet and immediately started demanding our immediate surrender and all that other fun shit, we wanted to see the measure of you. And the fact that you had offered up your crew's lives to defend your own shows us that you are nothing more than a bitch. We see this in our bars all the time, the little guy who causes problems and then wants everyone else to fight for him. Just a little bitch. Those who decide to use civilians as human shields. Yes, we know you use the other species to try and block our weapons, That's just a little bitch. And now, you little bitch, you understand. Humanity was perfectly fine dealing with ourselves, reaching out amongst the stars, trying to survive ourselves. But instead, we had to deal with your leathery ass. It's not like we're still trying to get words out, trying desperately to find something. But he was again interrupted. You know, I have a feeling that even if we weren't trying to protect ourselves from ourselves, if our folks had even been awake, the first thing you would have done was try to enslave us anyway. Because that's the way you are. You're nothing but a no-ball bitch. The translation came out to no testicles, female canine. It's not like was confused. He looked down and thought for a second, but I have them. With that, the old man pulled out his sidearm and a large bang was heard. And then he was a whole lot closer in his description. Snotlick curled himself into a ball as this was the worst pain he had felt, even worse than being dragged with a compound fracture and losing fingers. And with that, the old man kneeled down, grabbed him by the throat, slammed him up against the side, and put the weapon underneath Snotlick's jaw. Since you don't exist, your people don't exist on this sector anymore, I guess this is going to be one of our new sectors. With that was a great insult to all of the Cortez culture, all of the things they have done for the past several hundred years to reach out into the stars and subjugate everyone and take over entire sectors. Snotlick looked and he realized they had completely lost everything. And the man simply seemed to growl, showing his front teeth but not making a sound, and said, "Welcome to the human sector, bitch." And that was the last thing Snotlick ever heard. As the crusade across the stars against the Cortez continued, word came out that Sector 187 had been double-checked and a single pod had been found still intact, buried in the rubble and still functional. For a moment, the Master Chief thought that maybe, just maybe, his people had survived. Maybe his family was still there. Unfortunately for him, it was his commander's daughter. His infant daughter. The only reason that she had survived is the fact that a child's pod is much, much smaller and usually placed in an area that is not going to be disturbed, usually right behind the parent, which allowed it to be more protected for when the roof fell in. Unfortunately, the commander still lost his wife, his other 2 sons, but at least there was one ray of hope. And because of this small, tiny ray of hope, the Cortez were not completely wiped out. They were forced back to a single, solitary sector, the one farthest away from the humans. One where there was a scrawny little outpost with barely 400 of their people. It was decided amongst all the humans that they would leave this one sector alone and leave them with a simple warning. If you ever find yourself in a human sector again, do yourself a favor. Run.